What if everything we know about civilization began with a lie? Not a small lie, but a comfortable one. A story simplified, polished, and repeated for thousands of years. They told us civilization began when humans learned to farm, when cities appeared, when laws were written. But they never told you what really happened in Mesopotamia. Because beneath the cracked clay tablets, beneath ruined temples and collapsed palaces, lies a truth that rewrites the story of humanity itself. A truth buried, not by time alone, but by silence. Few people realize this, but the world you live in today, its laws, its cities, its power structures, were shaped by choices made over 6,000 years ago, between two rivers in a land now almost erased by war and sand. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Mesopotamia. The word itself sounds distant, academic, safe. But it should make us uncomfortable. Because Mesopotamia is not just ancient history, it is the operating system of the modern world. Located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now modern-day Iraq, parts of Syria, Turkey, and Iran, this land was later called the Cradle of Civilization. But that title hides something important. Cradles are gentle. What happened here was not. This was the first place where humans stopped living as equals and began living under systems. Systems of power, systems of control, systems of belief, kings, laws, borders, slavery, war. All of them were born here. Yet most history books reduce Mesopotamia to a timeline, a few city names, and some dusty museum artifacts. Why? Because the full story raises a disturbing question. Was civilization a gift or a trap? Welcome to Hidden History World, where we uncover the world's forgotten past, one story at a time. And tonight, we return to the very beginning. Before cities, before writing, before gods carved into stone, there was only land. Wild, unpredictable land. Around 10,000 BCE, the region known as Mesopotamia was not an empire, it was a floodplain. Seasonal floods from the Tigris and Euphrates brought both life and death. Too little water, people starved. Too much water, entire settlements vanished overnight. Humans here lived as small agricultural communities, sharing resources with no permanent rulers. Archaeological evidence from pre-pottery Neolithic sites suggests early villages had no palaces, no royal tombs, no elite graves. In death, people were equal, but that equality would not last. Because survival demanded organization, and organization demanded leadership. That was only the beginning. Around 4000 BCE, something unprecedented happened. Humans stopped moving. They built cities. The first true urban centers in history emerged. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu. Uruk alone may have housed 40,000 to 50,000 people, making it the largest city on Earth at the time. But cities are not just buildings. Cities require food surplus, labor control, defense, administration, and most importantly, authority. To manage irrigation canals, someone had to decide who worked and who benefited. To protect grain stores, someone had to command armed men. This is where history quietly changes direction, because leadership became power, and power began to separate humans into classes. Few historians mention this detail, but the earliest cities show clear evidence of social inequality. Large houses near temples, small cramped dwellings on the outskirts, burials with gold, and burials with nothing. Civilization had a cost. Before kings wore crowns, the gods ruled Mesopotamia. Temples, called ziggurats, rose above cities like artificial mountains. These were not just religious centers. They were economic hubs, storage facilities, administrative offices. Priests controlled grain distribution. Priests interpreted the will of the gods. Priests legitimized authority. In early Mesopotamia, power was invisible, wrapped in divine language. If you question leadership, you question the gods. Clay tablets from Uruk reveal early accounting records, lists of grain, beer, sheep. This wasn't religion. This was bureaucracy. And to manage it all, humans invented something revolutionary. Around 3200 BCE, Mesopotamians invented cuneiform writing. At first, it was not poetry, not stories, not philosophy. It was accounting. Who owed what? Who delivered grain? Who failed to pay? Writing made power permanent. Spoken words fade. Written records accuse forever. Few people realize this, but writing began as a tool of control, not creativity. And once information was written, only a small elite could read it. Knowledge became exclusive. Civilization now had cities, temples, writing, social hierarchy. But one thing was still missing: a single human voice at the top, a king. Early Mesopotamian rulers did not call themselves kings. They called themselves shepherds, servants of the gods. But slowly, titles changed. Power concentrated. By 2900 BCE, city-states were ruled by Lugal, warrior kings. War became constant. City against city. Canal against canal. God against God. Inscriptions boast not of peace, but of destruction. Captured enemies. Burned cities. Enslaved populations. Civilization had created warfare on an industrial scale. But buried beneath these records lies a truth almost forgotten. These wars were not inevitable. They were choices. And those choices would echo for millennia. So here we are. Humans had achieved agriculture, cities, writing, religion, kingship. By every textbook definition, civilization was born. But something crucial was lost. Equality, freedom, balance with nature. What if civilization was not humanity's greatest leap forward, but its first irreversible mistake?
At first, Mesopotamia was ruled by gods, then by kings. But power alone was not enough. Power needed legitimacy, and legitimacy needed law. Around 1754 BCE, in the city of Babylon, a single monument changed human history forever. A black stone pillar, over 7 feet tall, carved with words meant to last for eternity. It was called the Code of Hammurabi. Few people realize this, but this was not the first set of laws. It was the first time power was frozen into stone, written not to protect the weak, but to preserve order. Hammurabi did not present himself as a tyrant. He claimed something far more powerful, that the gods themselves, especially Shamash, the god of justice, had chosen him to rule. At the top of the stele, carved in relief, Hammurabi stands before Shamash, receiving divine authority. The message was clear: disobey the law, and you disobey the gods. Few historians mention this detail, but the Code of Hammurabi begins not with justice, but with fear. Fear of divine punishment, fear of chaos, fear of questioning authority. And then the laws begin. The code contains 282 laws. They cover theft, marriage, slavery, debt, violence, property, labor. But here is the truth textbooks often soften. The law was not equal. Punishment depended on who you were. If a noble harmed another noble, punishment followed one rule. If a noble harmed a commoner, another rule. If a commoner harmed a slave, almost no consequence. An eye for an eye was only for those of the same class. Justice was hierarchical, and that hierarchy was intentional. Civilization now had a legal system, but not a moral one. Behind the grand temples, behind the canals and walls, was forced labor. Slavery was not a side effect of Mesopotamian civilization. It was its foundation. Captured prisoners of war, dead slaves, children sold by families during famine. Clay tablets record human beings listed like property, bought, sold, inherited. Few people know this, but some slaves were branded, marked permanently. Civilization demanded labor, and labor demanded ownership of bodies. This was not accidental. It was structural. Mesopotamian women had more legal recognition than many later societies. They could own property, conduct business, appear in court. But freedom came with limits. Marriage contracts treated women as assets. Adultery laws punished women far more harshly than men. Some crimes resulted in drowning. The river became judge and executioner. Thrown into water, if she survived, she was innocent. If she drowned, the gods had spoken. Few historians dwell on this cruelty, but it was real. Civilization was sophisticated and merciless. Mesopotamia was never one empire at first. It was dozens of city-states, each with its own god, army, and ambition. Lagash fought Umma. Uruk fought Kish. Babylon rose over them all. War was constant. Victory inscriptions boast of beheadings, mass enslavement, city burnings. This was not chaos. It was organized violence, and it was justified as divine will. But that's not the whole story, because war created something new, a centralized state. By 2300 BCE, A man named Sargon of Akkad did something unprecedented. He conquered multiple city-states. Not temporarily, permanently. He created the world's first empire. Standardized language, standing army, central administration. The king was no longer a city ruler. He was ruler of the world. And once that model existed, it could never be undone. Every empire after, Assyrian, Persian, Roman, followed the same blueprint. Few people realize this. Modern states still do. Scribes became the most powerful class. They alone could read and write. They recorded laws, taxes, myths, history. And history is written by those who hold the stylus. What they chose not to record disappeared forever. Voices of peasants, voices of slaves, voices of the defeated. Silence became policy. Civilization had mastered memory and weaponized it. So ask yourself, cities rose. Empires expanded. Law and writing flourished. But human life became cheaper. Individual freedom shrank. Power concentrated. What if civilization's greatest achievement was also humanity's greatest loss?
The gods of Mesopotamia were not kind. They were not loving. They were not forgiving. They were powerful, demanding, and dangerously unpredictable. Unlike later religions that promised salvation, Mesopotamian gods promised only survival. The sky god Anu ruled from above. Enlil, god of wind and storms, decided the fate of cities. Enki, god of wisdom, held secrets too dangerous for humans. And humanity? Humanity was created for one purpose: to serve. Clay tablets stated clearly, humans were made to work so the gods would not have to. Few people realize this, but in Mesopotamian belief, human suffering was not a tragedy, it was expected. Mesopotamians believed the universe was chaotic by nature. Order was fragile, temporary, always under threat. Every flood, every drought, every disease outbreak was a sign of divine anger. There was no promise of heaven. The afterlife was a dark, silent underworld, a place of dust and shadows. No reward, no justice, only existence. This belief shaped everything. Why fight wars? Because gods demanded it. Why obey kings? Because gods appointed them. Why accept suffering? Because resistance was pointless. Religion was not comfort, it was control. Nothing happened by accident. A deformed animal birth, a solar eclipse, a cracked liver during sacrifice. Everything meant something. Priests studied omens obsessively. Thousands of tablets detail how to interpret signs. If a sheep's liver looks like this, disaster. If the moon darkens, rebellion. If lightning strikes a temple, war. This created a society trapped in anxiety, every decision delayed by fear of signs. But buried beneath this obsession lies something deeper, a realization that humans were not in control. Among all Mesopotamian texts, one stands above the rest, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written over 4,000 years ago, it is the oldest surviving epic in human history. But it is not a heroic fantasy, it is a warning. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was powerful, brilliant, and cruel. The gods created Enkidu to challenge him, a wild man of nature. Together they achieved glory, but Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is broken. For the first time in recorded history, a human fears death and searches for immortality. Gilgamesh travels beyond the world. He meets Utnapishtim, a man who survived a great flood and was granted eternal life. Sound familiar? Few people know this, but the flood story existed over 1,000 years before the Bible. In the Mesopotamian version, the gods grow tired of human noise. They decide to wipe humanity out. Only one man survives, not because humans were sinful, but because they were annoying. This is not a moral story, it is a terrifying one. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the truth. Civilization had existed before. Cities, people, order, and it was erased. The flood was not punishment, it was a reset. Archaeological evidence supports this fear. Excavations at Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak reveal massive flood layers, entire cultures buried under mud. But that's not the whole story, because after the flood, the gods regret their decision. Not because of guilt, but because without humans, there is no one left to serve them. Humanity exists by accident. Utnapishtim tests Gilgamesh. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh fails. He is human, mortal. The gods allow him one consolation prize, a plant that restores youth. On his journey home, a snake steals it and sheds its skin, renewed. Gilgamesh returns empty-handed, older, wiser, broken. The first story humanity ever wrote ends with this truth: you will die, and nothing can change that. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not about heroes, it is about limits. Limits of power, limits of civilization, limits of humanity. Mesopotamians understood something we often forget. Progress does not defeat death. Technology does not save us. Empires fall. Civilization itself is temporary. Few historians emphasize this, but Mesopotamia believed the world would end. Not in fire, but in collapse. So now we know. They built cities, knowing floods would destroy them. They wrote laws, knowing kings would fall. They worshipped gods who did not love them. Why? Because they believed survival, even briefly, was enough. In the final part, we will witness the collapse of Mesopotamia itself. How invasions, climate change, and internal decay destroyed the world's first civilization, and why its fall looks terrifyingly familiar, because what killed Mesopotamia may be killing us, too. Civilizations rarely fall overnight. They decay, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Mesopotamia was no exception. By 2200 BCE, something changed. The rivers that once gave life became unpredictable. Rainfall declined, harvests failed, canals dried up. Modern climate studies confirm a 4.2 kiloyear event, a massive drought that affected the entire Near East. Cities that depended on irrigation began to starve. People prayed. The gods remained silent. And when hunger arrives, order collapses. The Akkadian Empire, the first empire in human history, was built on conquest, but conquest cannot defeat famine. Texts from the period speak of empty storehouses, abandoned cities, refugees flooding south. Inscriptions describe chaos. The fields produced no grain. Rebellions erupted. Trade routes collapsed. The empire fractured. Few people realize this, but the world's first empire ended not with glory, but with hunger. As resources vanished, inequality sharpened. Elites protected themselves, commoners suffered. Debt slavery increased, social unrest spread. Law, once meant to preserve order, now protected only the powerful. Trust collapsed. And when trust disappears, civilization becomes fragile. This was not invasion, this was internal failure. Weak civilizations invite enemies, Amorites, Gutians, later Kassites. They moved into weakened lands, cities fell one by one, libraries burned, temples collapsed, records shattered, and with them, memory vanished. Few people understand this loss, because when Mesopotamia fell, history itself went dark. Centuries later, Assyria rose, stronger, more brutal. Assyrian kings ruled through terror. They recorded their cruelty proudly. Mass deportations, public executions, entire cities erased. Fear became policy. For a time, it worked. But fear cannot sustain an empire forever. By 612 BCE, Assyria collapsed violently. Its capital, Nineveh, was destroyed, buried so completely that its location was forgotten for over 2,000 years. The mightiest empire of its age, erased. Babylon rose again, magnificent, cultured, powerful. Hanging gardens, astronomy, mathematics. But Babylon faced the same truth. Empires age. By 539 BCE, Babylon fell to Persia, not with fire, but with barely a fight. The world's oldest civilization ended quietly, almost unnoticed. Why don't we talk about Mesopotamia more? Because it left no single religion, no unified identity, no surviving empire. Its clay tablets cracked, its cities buried. Europe remembered Greece and Rome. Mesopotamia became a footnote, until archaeologists dug it back up in the 19th century, and what they found was unsettling. Mesopotamia teaches us something uncomfortable. Civilization is not destiny. It is fragile. It depends on climate, resources, social trust, restraint. Lose any of these, and collapse follows. They believed the gods would save them. They didn't. Look around. Climate instability, resource stress, inequality, permanent warfare, information controlled by elites. Sound familiar? Mesopotamia is not ancient history. It is a warning. Mesopotamia gave us cities, writing, law, empire, history itself, and it lost everything. Not because humans were evil, but because systems outgrew wisdom. So ask yourself, if the world's first civilization collapsed despite knowing the risks, what makes us think we are different? If this truth stayed hidden for centuries, what else have they erased from our past? Subscribe to Hidden History World. Like this video. Turn on notifications. Join us again as we uncover another forgotten chapter of world history.